So I feel like we're stepping out onto like a rickety bridge, over a ravine with this episode.
Yes.
Everything that can go wrong will go wrong.
And at the worst possible time, isn't that the...
That's right.
That's the thing.
That's right. Well, I'm glad we're in it together.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wouldn't fall down this ravine with anybody else.
And this is the first time we're late with an episode, right? I think.
This is, yeah.
Wait, didn't we have one late one before?
Nah,
No.
We've been fucking keeping it real. Yeah, the Ustasha fucked us. As they do. Welcome to The Empire Never Ended. Got Boris, Fritz, and Ray.
Yo.
Getting into some dark shit today. Some bad people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is probably the bloodiest, the most depressing one.
Yeah. Ustašas in power, the so-called Independent State of Croatia.
Yeah, the chaotic monstrosity that is the Independent State of Croatia.
Yeah. And we're also doing it for the second time now because...
yeah, we had some recording issues with our mics here.
Yeah, pretty much every time we've tried to cover a Croatian topic, something's gone wrong with the audio, except for our Denuncio episode. Which,
no, it's really cursed.
Yeah.
So this is why we're late, and we are recording this on Monday when it's supposed to be out, but because the first recording got fucked.
The first recorder suffered from many, many issues. Technical ones, and yes. All right, well, let's get right into it, shall we?
Let's get into it, yeah.
Well, since it's been, I think, a couple weeks since we left our Ustašas behind, we'll give a little quick recap just to remind everybody where we're at.
Great.
So when we left off with the last Ustaša episode, Pavelić and most of the main Ante Pavelić and most of the main Ustaša figures are abroad, mostly in Italy and Hungary. The situation in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia has deteriorated to the point that the country is on the verge of invasion. And for our purposes, that's about it.
Yeah.
Because the Germans invade, the Axis powers invade on the 6th of April, 1941, again with the carpet bombing of Belgrade, and the Royal Yugoslav Army falls apart and ends with unconditional surrender on April 18th. Of course, the country is partitioned between Italy and Germany primarily, but also Hungarians, Bulgarians, Romanians Hungarians get little pieces of Yugoslavia as well. So the Germans had decided, right, to give the Ustašas a state. And there had been some deliberation about this, but the events in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia made it the conditions favorable for the Croats to get their way. And so the Independent State of Croatia was brought into power by the German military, right?
Yeah.
And the state itself was proclaimed on the 10th of April by Slavko Kvaternik, who was one of the founders of the Ustaša movement, who was married to the daughter of Josip Frank, who we talked about in previous episodes.
Right.
He was also a former Austro-Hungarian army officer. And this proclamation was timed precisely to match with the German entry into Zagreb. And ironically enough, Pavelić and most of the other high-ranking Ustaša leaders weren't even there yet. Pavelić himself would only arrive into Zagreb with some of his crew on the 15th of April. So, kind of from the beginning, you see this disorganization that would really plague the state for its entire existence.
They announced the independent state of Croatia while its leader was abroad, and they celebrated it with the entry of a foreign army.
Yes. So, the guy who was literally their Fuhrer wasn't even there to proclaim the state.
The Germans must have been very annoyed.
I think the Germans. I think the Germans
were initially... They don't do well with schedule changes.
No, yeah, that's true. Although, I mean, they had reason to believe that that this wasn't going to be so bad after all, because they were greeted by thousands of enthusiastic people in Zagreb.
Right.
There was some, in the very beginning at least, some enthusiasm for this new state. A lot of people were dissatisfied with the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and the like. So, in the beginning, it maybe seemed like they would do all right. But, I mean, that would quickly deteriorate, as we'll cover soon.
Uh-huh.
So Pavelić comes back on the 15th, and we discussed before that this movement was never particularly large, right? And so according to most sources, the number of men that came back from abroad was at first only like 200 to 300 guys that came with the Germans in like the initial thrust of the invasion.
Yeah.
And then maybe an additional 500 to 600. These numbers kind of vary in like the next few weeks, right? By May, like another 500 or 600. So we're talking about 1,000 or so emigres, who were the most radical, of course, and they did have their sympathizers already in Croatia. The Ustašas themselves said that they had up to 5,000 members, although this was not.
But we know that they were not a very popular movement since they were founded by one faction of the Frankovci faction of the Croatian Party of Rights. And when they were like running in elections in the 20s or before that even, they were not getting so much votes. I think they had like one or two deputies only in the parliament. And the main party, the most popular party also in Croatia, was the Peasant Party led by Stjepan Radić, by far the most popular Croatian nationalist party.
And so, like I mentioned, there was an initial wave of enthusiasm. So, within the first few days, the first few weeks of establishing the state, there were a lot of people who signed up and joined the movement. But as we'll see, I mean, this enthusiasm drops pretty rapidly. So almost as immediately after coming to power, they started enacting their principles, which, as we've discussed in previous episodes, was pretty crude to begin with, right? And was based mostly on these 16 principles for life that...
No, half of them are be a Croat. Be as Croat as you can.
Yeah, half of them are be a Croat and listen to the poglavnik.
That's it, yeah, that's the other half. Listen to the poglavnik. Done.
Yeah, which, of course, the most important one, or one of the most important ones here, is the 11th principle, which stated, in state and national affairs in the independent state of Croatia, nobody can participate in decision-making who is not by origin and blood a member of the Croatian nation. Furthermore, no foreign nation or state should determine the fate of the Croatian nation. Now, this is kind of ironic on a couple levels, because no foreign nation or state should determine the fate of the Croatian nation. I mean, this state was created
by Germany. Yeah.
By Germany.
Yeah.
But the important part of this is that it excludes, right, all national minorities from any kind of legal right or representation in the state. So it puts them outside of the law. With the notable exception of the ethnic Germans, the like Volksdeutsch population, which was given a special status of their own.
Okay. Sure.
But the problems start immediately, right? So one of the other laws that followed is the law on citizenship, which is even more explicit, which is a citizen is a resident of the state of Aryan origin who has by his actions shown that he has not worked against the liberating tendencies of the Croatian people and who is prepared to serve readily and faithfully the Croatian people and the independent state of Croatia. This one also excludes...
Or Germany, whichever.
Yes. But this one also excludes political enemies, right? Because it explicitly states that who has, by his actions, shown that he has not worked against the liberating tendencies of the Croatian people. So that then also includes all the political dissidents that they would go readily about killing very soon. So, of course, in defining the Croatian nation here, they had a tricky situation because the state that they were given was one of the most, let's say, ambitious visions of what Croatian territory is. So we're talking about most of modern-day Croatia, with the exception of Dalmatia, which was given to the Italians.
Yeah, important exception.
Very important exception.
But
and
formally,
Istria,
it was a part of the state, right? Like
it would be only later after the Italians capitulated.
Okay, because I know that the Italians had the control of it, but all the like maps that I see of the independent state of Croatia always include Dalmatia. So I thought they.
So apparently, I read somewhere that Pavelić himself was not a fan of Dalmatians as people. He, in fact, I think there's an account of him joking with the Germans, saying the best possible solution is for us to get Dalmatia and Italy to get the Dalmatians.
So, it's because they're not It's because they're not entirely white people. You know, they have those little black spots all over.
Oh,
hey,
good one there, Fritz. I was wondering if somebody would work in a 101 Dalmatians reference or something. Yeah. But I mean, this would be one of this big series of errors that the Ustašas would make, is giving up Dalmatia, because it turns out most of those people there were not too happy about it. Didn't particularly want to live under the Italians. But yes, so most of modern day Croatia without Istria and Dalmatia, which was given to Italy, but then included all of modern day Bosnia Herzegovina, and then parts of Serbia as well, Vojvodina,
Srem, yes.
Srem, all the way up to Zemun, which is now part of Belgrade.
Yeah. So basically, parts of Belgrade were parts of the Ustaša State.
Yeah. Now this is massive, and it's a massive state to give to 1,000 weirdos who had very little experience, very little experience governing anything, and had very little popular support. The other biggest problem here is that the Croats as a nation here are not even in a clear majority, right? The population at the time was 6.5 or so million people, almost 7, of which 2 million or so were Serbs. Now, since the Ustašas define Croats as including Bosnian Muslims or Bosniak people, they were able to have a larger percentage of the population as Croats. Of course, we'll go into this in our special episode just about the status of Muslims during the Second World War. Not all of them were too enthusiastic about being Croats either, but they were officially regarded as Croats.
I guess they also had their buddy Drljević eventually trying to offer Montenegro, huh?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but that had even less support than any of the Ustašas. I mean, that was complete fuckery. I mean, I had no idea what they were doing. So immediately they have this large state, and they set up a regime that is kind of modeled after Nazi Germany, kind of modeled after Italian fascism, but as we mentioned before, is largely based on these 16 principles. They tried to develop this a little bit more, right? So officially they had some sort of corporative state program and this ideology called Croatian Socialism, which would kind of develop over time, although it was never a coherent ideology, because as we'll see, they had a very hard time implementing anything that wasn't just killing people. And a series of missteps from the very beginning also made it so that they had very little functioning economy or anything to begin with, and then lack of control over large parts of the country. So ultimately, the main organ of power was this Supreme Ustasha headquarters, which was led by Ante Pavelić, who was the poglavnik, or their kind of version of a fuhrer, and then a council of deputies, and then various levels of organization that went down to the village level, which had weird names like Swarm and shit like that. And of course, having like their own little Hitler Youth and a women's organization. But of course, ultimately, everything came down to Pavelić. And then, like we mentioned in the previous episode, there was a divide between the emigre Ustašas and the Ustašas that were already in the country. And this would prove to be a pretty big divide once they came to power, too, because Pavelić didn't really trust anybody except for his loyal emigres.
I mean, yeah. So the Croatian like Ustaša Führer Ante Pavelić has his. I mean, we covered that already, but he has his like political origins in the Croatian Party of Rights, which has its roots in the 19th century. It was always kind of a weird nationalist party there, but then in the early 20th century, more extreme wing called Frankovci, because of their leader Frank, developed, and Ante Pavelić was one of the leaders of this more extreme party of rights, and was in the monarchist Yugoslavia in the 20s. He was a politician. He was actually a deputy of the Party of Rights in the parliament in Belgrade, and had, I mean, we'll talk about that in the premium episode, had some kind of interesting and weird connections with the regime in Belgrade, and was even seen in the 20s as a kind of a Belgrade man in the party, let's say. But then even this more extreme wing of the Party of Rights grew even extremer in the end of the 20s, and basically became a kind of a underground terrorist organization, mostly of people who mostly left Yugoslavia and left abroad and were connected with different anti-Yugoslav foreign regimes, one of which was Mussolini's, who also organized training camps for Ante Pavelić and his guys there. So yeah, and again, he was by education a lawyer, and most of these, and also a practicing lawyer, and most of these people were kind of that kind of origin, mostly middle class professionals, and former Austro-Hungarian bureaucrats, a lot of them. Yeah. And so although they were like, their ideology structured around the Croatian peasant, but really the Croatian peasant was not so much into them. They were mostly supportive of the Croatian Peasant Party.
Yeah, and so since ultimately the final word came down to Pavelić and everything, they got to work pretty quickly developing a cult of personality around him, which was mostly worked on by this chief of propaganda, Vilko Riger, who was tasked with both developing like a kind of Führerprinzip for Ante Pavelić, but also making some sort of Ustaša ideology. So he would write that the Ustaša ideology is the closest to National Socialism, even among other fascisms in Europe, that it is pretty much just Croatian National Socialism, and thus, like, you know, this is why they have a good relationship with the Germans. But then also he developed this poglavnik principle, which is that basically the poglavnik is the most sacred authority in the state, and today in the independent state of Croatia, social, economic, political, religious, educational, and legal views are identical to those of the poglavnik, the carrier of the new order. Just a funny aside about this guy, Vilko Riger, he ended up living in the United States after the war and going by the name William S. Riger, and was an economics professor at a Catholic women's college in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Wow. So, I mean, the chief of propaganda for the independent state of Croatia, like, lived out his days in Scranton, teaching economics.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the few places that you'll never, ever, ever have to teach Marxism as an economics school in the U.S. So, I guess...
especially not at a Catholic women's college, I think.
No, I think you're probably
the
safe
50s
there.
and 60s.
Yeah. Felt right at home, I'm sure.
But possibly the most important organ of the state that they developed immediately was the Ustasha Militia, which was its own military, kind of like a Croatian SS. It didn't have that name, but it was an ideological military unit. And these guys would go on to do most of the kind of most notorious Ustasha atrocities, and were also responsible for establishing the concentration camps, which we'll talk about soon, and had this infamous division called the Black Legion. And the commanders of the Ustasha militia were mostly these freaks from from abroad, right? Jure Francetić, Rafael Boban, Vjekoslav Luburić, who would go on to be the camp commandant of most of these concentration camps, particularly Jasenovac. So they established the state. They had this massive state, and you'd think they'd get to work implementing their principles, which they did. So since they removed non-Aryan people, namely in this case Serbs and Jews and Romani people from the law, they immediately went about confiscating property and industry from Jews and Serbs and putting Ustašas into these positions, which did not great thing for the economy, because it largely, I think, went on some sort of nepotistic line. Confiscating property from Serbs and Jews was a priority of theirs, of course, but since we've, talked about the fact that these people were pretty fanatical and violent in their opinion of Jews and Serbs in particular, they got to work just killing people, right? So they clearly have this demographic problem of having about 2 million Serbs in a state of 7 million, and decided that the best way to go about this problem would be to get rid of them. And by get rid of them, this primarily meant terrorizing and killing them and deporting large numbers. So within the first few weeks of them being in power, they had already started to commit massacres across their territory. So most notably, a thorn in the side of the Ustašas was the fact that there were several Serb majority regions in Croatia that were very close to Zagreb. And this is where they started committing some of the earliest atrocities. Like I said, within the first few weeks of them being in power, these Ustasha militias were already going out and massacring Serbs in villages, killing hundreds of people. And then as well in Bosnia, there were similar atrocities being carried out, some by some of these Muslim Ustasha units. And predictably, this didn't go over very well with the population that was living there. Turns out if you start wholesale slaughtering people, they're not just going to sit down, lay down and take it.
People do not like that.
So you have, within the first few weeks of their rule, armed resistance starting to pop out throughout their territory.
Two factors that really kind of were crucial in contributing to the rise of a very large resistance there was one that you mentioned already, the fact that they gave up control over Dalmatia to Mussolini, and the other was the massacres of the Serbs. So people from Dalmatia and Serbs, ethnic Serbs in particular, really were kind of the basis for the resistance, especially in 41.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the first instances of organized resistance that you see is not so organized at all, but it occurred in May of 1941 in the Sanski Most area of Bosnia, where massacres perpetrated against the local Serbian population forced a few Serbian villages to just start resisting out of just need for survival. I mean,
right.
and with very little weapons, we're just organizing village militias to fight back against these Ustašas that were committing massacres against them. And this is, not even anything with any clear ideological line. It's just people
we just stop
fighting back.
Yeah.
But you did, of course, immediately have resistance from Chetnik groups, who we've talked about a little before and we'll talk about in more detail later. But primarily Serbian monarchist, loyalist, or nationalists who were organized primarily by former Yugoslav army, Royal Yugoslav Army officers who considered themselves the Yugoslav army in the fatherland. And then, of course, in already by June, so 2 months or so after the Independent State of Croatia is established, you have the first partisan division in Croatia formed. So on the 22nd of June in 1941, you have the Sisak People's Liberation Partisan Detachment formed in a forest near the city of Sisak, which is only about an hour or so drive from Zagreb. So their ability...
Yeah, so right under their nose. Like
right under their
the
nose.
backyard.
I mean,
yeah.
Very close to the capital. You already have...
And already
armed.
really showing themselves clearly unable to hold even like the most basic territory around like their heart, their center.
Yeah. But of course, I mean, this didn't stop them from doing what they did best, which is
just wholesale
slaughter people.
Yeah.
Wholesale slaughter. And I don't know. I think I have a problem in this episode trying to determine what level of detail we should go in about these things. I mean, because they are quite horrific. I mean, it's some really bad shit.
It is, yeah.
But
I mean,
particularly
let's say
heinous.
They were like they preferred to use like cold weapons.
Yes.
And like special kinds of knives that they gave morbid names based on like they were meant for killing Serbs in particular.
It's called like
and
the
also
Serb
like
cutter, something like this,
Yeah.
no?
Yeah.
Srbosek.
Yeah, this would be used primarily in their concentration camps, but yeah, the Serb cutter is a modified knife that would be typically used for agricultural purposes or like slaughtering of animals, like villages. They repurpose that for slaughtering people. And you know, the Ustašas were particularly notorious for their use of cold weapons, and also for the fact that, for example, they had out of the 22 concentration camps that they would establish across their entire territory, were I think the only ones in Europe that established separate camps only for children.
Yeah, like extermination camps for kids.
Yes, which was in the city of Sisak, where this first partisan detachment was established in June of 1941. So I mean, it's not hard to see what drove people into the arms of resistance forces nearly immediately. Like, I mean, we're talking within the first 2 months of their power.
Yeah, it's not really hard to. It's not hard to pick a side in this. You know, you've got the guys making extermination camps for kids, and on the other hand, you've got guys who really like sharing, and those are your choices.
Yeah.
I see how also, they had a hard time selling Ustasha ideology to these people.
One of the preferred weapons was like a sledgehammer.
Fuck.
They killed like thousands of people like that.
Ugh.
So it's really horrific. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, socialism is definitely better.
Yeah.
What, than Croatian socialism?
Than Croatian socialism, yes.
Croatian socialism just seems to be killing
Chaos.
Serbs and Jews.
Yeah, no, just regular socialism, still better.
Now, we should mention that, of course, most of this killing was happening in the countryside by these various Ustasha militias that would behave much in the same way that German Einsatzgruppen would behave when they invaded the Soviet Union. The difference being, of course, that when the German Einsatzgruppen were working in, you know, Ukraine and Belarus, the average German didn't have to see this. In the independent state of Croatia, you know, you're talking about them killing people not only in Serb majority villages, but also in towns and cities across the country, which, you know, despite even some initial enthusiasm that, you know, some average Croats might have had for having an independent state, seeing that level of brutality right on your doorstep is also not a particularly endearing thing. And the fact that the Ustasha, you know, police state was even worse than the Yugoslav monarchy from the very beginning. Also, didn't bode well for their support among Croats. Because it's worth noting that, I mean, while some of these initial resistance groups, you know, of course, Chetniks are almost all Serbs, there were a lot of Croats, right? There were a lot of Croat anti-fascists and party members who had that affiliation before the war. So when the partisan detachment started, there were a lot of Croats as well going into this. It's worth emphasizing over and over and over again how how little support the Ustašas actually had. Because they were basically only good at killing people. I think that maybe now we can talk quickly about the Jasenovac concentration camp, which was the largest and by far most brutal camp of theirs. Now, this camp was established pretty soon after the Ustašas came to power. It's located on the Sava River on the modern-day border between Croatia and Bosnia, and it's a difficult subject to talk about for a few reasons. One, notably, that it's subject to a lot of historical revisionism by various different nationalist groups today. Although it should be said that most real scholars of like the Holocaust and of the Second World War in Yugoslavia do agree about certain numbers, about the numbers of people killed there, because this is
also big. Like official institutions from both Serbia and Croatia basically agree.
And what they more or less agree on, I mean, there's a variation in numbers here, but it usually ranges between 70,000 to 100,000+, give or take a couple.
Because the institution in Belgrade and the one in Zagreb are identifying victims by name, and I think they identified around this lower number that you mentioned, 70,000, 80,000, something like this. In both countries, some similar number, and they project that the total number is above 100,000, like maybe up to 120. I'm not exactly sure, but those are the numbers that people, official like historians and from institutions from both Zagreb and Belgrade, kind of agree on.
Yeah, and the historical revisionism that we're talking about here is largely now something that came around in the 90s. Although I mean these fascist demigray communities in the Cold War period kept some of those ideas alive. For example, even the first president of quote unquote democratic Croatia in the 90s, Franjo Tudjman, wrote a book minimizing the number killed in Jasenovac.
Although he was a partisan and a communist general.
The youngest general ever in communist Yugoslavia. Yeah, he knew very well. I mean, he was an active participant, a partisan, what was going on. But he wrote a book minimizing the number of dead there.
And on the other hand, the Serbian nationalists are like totally using some huge numbers, like greatly enlarged.
They say like 1 million people were.
Yeah, the number that's usually repeated over and over again by Serbian nationalists is 700,000 in Jasenovac.
Yeah,
and I mean a lot of people think that that's kind of a realistic number because it was so dominant in nationalist ideology and repeated like 1 million of times.
Yeah, I mean.
Of course, I mean, we're only talking about people killed in Jasenovac, which was, as you said, the largest camp run by Ustašas, but most people were killed by Ustašas were killed outside of concentration camps, I think, just by ethnically cleansing villages and so on.
Yeah.
So that the whole number of people killed in the Independent State of Croatia is in hundreds of thousands of, I don't know.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And part of the issue with the numbers at Jasenovac is, I mean, kind of the same type of ineptitude that the Independent State of Croatia had in general, is that they didn't really keep records in the same way that the Germans did. Germans kept very meticulous records. So I mean, in the cases of Nazi extermination camps, there was far more paperwork, showing the number of prisoners there. When the Ustašas, in an internal memo of the Ustasha secret police to headquarters back in Zagreb, they said that Jasenovac has the capacity for an unlimited number of inmates. Mm-hmm. And it has a capacity for the unlimited number of inmates because they were just killing them so fast that, they said, you can just keep bringing them, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
They weren't keeping them around for long enough for capacity to be an issue.
I think that around 2/3 of the people in prison in Jasenovac were Serbs, and then I think of course there were like many Jews and Roma people, And also just Croatian anti-fascist, communist, and so on.
And of course, I think the true number of Roma people will almost never be known because they weren't even particularly counted by pre-war censuses, and that nobody really cared about them to begin with.
The Holocaust in general with Roma people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it should be mentioned that, most of Yugoslavia's Jews perished in camps within the independent state of Croatia. So, some were, of course, also deported to the German death camps. But the Ustasha did well to take care of the Jewish problem in Croatia themselves. And Yugoslavia didn't have a huge Jewish population to begin with, but it did have a significant community in Bosnia, and specifically in Sarajevo, which is a very old Sephardic community that was almost completely wiped out by the Ustasha. And there's something that's worth bringing up as well in terms of Ustasha racial laws, is that this gets talked about sometimes, but it's a very limited exception that they made for this kind of honorary Aryan status.
Well done saying that.
It's
a hard one. Honorary Aryan.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Now, honorary Aryan was applied
Bravo.
for Jews who could petition the state to say that through their deeds, right, they had proved that they were loyal to the Croatian state. Right, because in that racial law that we read off earlier, that's an important part, right? Whether they can prove that they have done something for Croatian people and Croatian state. These exemptions were very rarely granted. They're very few, and they tended to be Jews who were married to Ustašas. So some people survived this way, but it was not really a thing. It was mostly a way for some Ustasha to not have to, kill his wife or something.
Right. Scum.
Yeah. But yeah, they were particularly concerned with killing off the Serbs. They solved, quote unquote, the Jewish question relatively quickly.
Although, you mentioned, I think Slavko Kvaternik, the guy who officially proclaimed the establishment of the Ustaša state. And you also said that he was married to the daughter of Josip Frank, the leader of the Frankovci faction of the party. They were, of course, Jewish. So he had a Jewish wife, and they had a son who was a notorious Ustaša called Dido Kvaternik. And it's interesting that, the mother of Dido Kvaternik and the wife of Slavko Kvaternik, the horrible Ustašas, was
right.
Jewish, and that she committed suicide in August of 41.
Yeah. So much for honorary Aryans.
Yeah.
They of course, just like the Nazis did everywhere. The Ustašas did really horrible things to the Jewish population. They made them destroy their own synagogues, and we all know how that went down, unfortunately. But since the rapid pace of killing happened immediately, the state was, like we mentioned, completely destabilized from the very beginning, and the Germans and Italians started to get kind of concerned about this because, well, they gave these guys a large portion of Yugoslavia, and it turns out that they're not very good at governing it. And it became pretty clear that they weren't going to be able to kill or deport all of the Serbs very quickly, like they had planned. For some reason, they just expected this to go quite smoothly. I don't know if they had gotten it in their heads that just every God-loving Croat would do his duty and kill his neighbors, but that didn't really happen. So they began to have to start reevaluating this kind of extreme position towards the Serbs, right? They'd killed already thousands of them and deported tens of thousands of them to Serbia, which was under the control of Milan Nedić, under German occupation, puppet government Milan Nedić. And they figured, okay, well, we're not going to kill all these guys. I guess we're going to have to convert some of them, right? If the problem is, Serbs are a problem, but it's mostly a problem because of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and some of them could become Croats if they rid themselves of that barbaric tradition of theirs. And in Bosnia, they particularly went on this line of the fact that many Croats were forced to convert to the Eastern Orthodox Church during the rule of the Ottomans, and so that they'd just be coming back to the church. Now, they instituted this policy at the end of 1941, which was already too little too late. For one reason being that, of course, the Ustaša State didn't have that much control over all of their regions, right? It was mostly left up to local mayors, commanders, bosses on what laws get implemented at all. And a lot of them just figured, we'll just kill him. It doesn't, we're not gonna go through with all this conversion shit. But they did, a good 250,000 people were forcibly converted to Catholicism. It should be mentioned too that some were converted to Islam, although since those were the two state religions in the Independent State of Croatia, there was an option for also becoming Muslim. But they figured that going from Orthodoxy to Catholicism is an easier conversion than going from Orthodoxy to Islam.
But even this didn't stop them from getting rolled up on by Ustasha and stuff, right?
Oh, no, not at all. Well, this is what I'm saying. I mean, there was some enthusiasm for this with the more radical factions within the Catholic Church in Croatia, and a lot of them were enthusiastically going out to the countryside to convert Serbs. But like I said, it was kind of too late for that, right? There was revolt throughout the whole country. And it doesn't help that, for example, in the town of Glina in Croatia, they had brought all these Serbs into a church to convert them, then locked the doors and burned several hundred people alive.
Yeah, it doesn't build trust, that.
No, it doesn't. It certainly doesn't build trust when something like that happens.
Hearts and minds, boys. Hearts and minds.
Yeah, they were not big on hearts and minds. Now, given that the attempt to convert the Serbs to Catholicism was also not going as planned.
And also they would sometimes convert them and then kill them anyway.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. What was the point of that?
No, there's no point.
It became clear that they would have to try something else. And in 1942, they decided, well, okay, if we can't kill them all, we can't make them all Catholic or maybe Muslim. The problem is with the Orthodox Church is that it's Serbian. Yes, it's like this barbaric Greek practice. Yes, all of our ideology was constructed around this that we talked a lot about
but hear me out.
in the 20s and 30s. But okay, well, this isn't going so well. So if we can't kill them, we can't make them Catholic, we can at least make the Orthodox Church Croatian.
By God, he's got it.
So in 1942, they tried to do just that. Now, again, we're talking about a year after they come to power. They've already burned through a bunch of different options on what to do with the Serbs.
Well, a bunch of different people too.
And a bunch of different people, and it mostly boiled down to the fact that, they were just doing the best at killing them, but we have to try to reach out to them somehow. And so let's found a Croatian Orthodox Church. Now, this is one of the weirder inventions of theirs, because in order to make a Croatian Orthodox Church, they created it out of people who weren't even Croats.
Sure.
So
it's meaningless anyway, so we might as well.
Or even Serbs. I mean, that's...
Or even Serbs. So this church was headed by a guy who has a kind of hilariously sci-fi kind of name of Patriarch Germogen.
Germogen.
Some sort of robot, whatever. This guy was a white Russian priest in the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. So right after the Russian Revolution, the emigre communities did not recognize the patriarch in Moscow. They called him the Red Patriarch because he was approved of by the Soviet authorities. And so they had their own hardcore monarchist white church outside of Russia. Now, this guy, Germogen, they dug him up somewhere. There was a large white emigre community within Yugoslavia.
They put his battery pack in.
The church that he was a part of, that you just mentioned, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, was actually formed in Yugoslavia.
Right.
And so I think that at the time, that was their kind of basis for their operations.
Yeah, I think he even lived in Zagreb before. But, I mean, he wasn't a particularly important figure in that church at all. I think they just dug him up and said, okay, here you go. You're the patriarch of the Croatian Orthodox Church now. Have fun. And this church was completely ineffective. It was only recognized. It wasn't recognized by the patriarch in Istanbul, who's as close as the Orthodox get to having like a more important patriarch. is one of the most important ones is the guy in Istanbul. Instead, they were recognized by the Romanian Orthodox Church and I think by the Bulgarians as well. But of course, Romania at the time was a clero-fascist state run by the Iron Guard. And, that's the extent of any kind of official recognition or authority that they had. Now, another figure that was involved with it was a guy that we talked about on our last premium episode about Montenegro, which is this Montenegrin nationalist Savić Marković, who had come to the brilliant conclusion that Montenegrins are actually Croats and that actually all Croats are, in fact, from Montenegro. He was put as being the kind of commissar, ideological head of this church. He wasn't religious, of course. He wasn't, he had no experience in the church, but he was kind of the ideological driver for this church. Now, much like converting Serbs to Catholicism, this was a completely empty gesture. And to my understanding, I don't think that the Croatian Orthodox Church had any kind of following among almost anybody, and all basically solely existed for propaganda purposes. So they'd march Germogen out when they were doing a state function, along with the various Muslim clerics and Catholic priests and the like, to show that we do have some Orthodox people. It's okay, you can be Orthodox as long as you're Croat.
Yeah, they drape his clanky metal arms in a robe and glue a beard on his lifeless metallic
wind him
up and send him on out there.
Send him out into Zagreb. Yeah, it certainly never had any. It certainly didn't have the same kind of following or any kind of following.
I'm just looking now. It's interesting that before he was appointed to be head of the Ustaša Church, he lived in a Serbian monastery on Fruška Gora mountain near Novi Sad called Novo Hopovo. And he was a member of the synod of the Russian church that he belonged to, which was also in Serbia, like today's Serbia, in Sremski Karlovci. And he was active there, I think, until from 24 until 42, when he was, recruited by the Ustašas. So he was basically living amongst, Serbs, I guess.
Yeah, I wonder. I haven't read enough about him to know what his motivations were for all of this. It doesn't seem like he's something a particularly, honorable character in any way. Yeah. Being head of a fictitious church in a genocidal monstrosity.
Yeah, Boris, but the head of it.
Head of it, yeah. Maybe he just wanted to don the patriarch's cap. And
hell yeah. That's why you get into the game.
In the end, he was executed by the Partisan.
And that's how you get out of the game.
Yeah, rightfully so.
Yeah.
So, as we've shown, the situation was rapidly deteriorating, right? So by this time, the Ustaša State had to face the fact that they were not in control of large parts of their territory. They were increasingly reliant on the Germans to do any kind of effective military actions against the partisans, who were rapidly gaining steam, and of course the Italians, who were in charge of, who had their own military zone within the independent state of Croatia, mostly parts of Herzegovina and other regions as well, who were reaching out to the Chetniks now to fight the partisans together. Now, the Ustašas were being encouraged by both the Italians and the Germans to collaborate with the Serbian nationalist Chetniks as much as possible. Mm-hmm. And this did happen to certain degrees, but also, as we've talked about in some of the previous episodes, this would also sometimes fall apart because, again, everything was up to local and regional commanders. So if some regional commander decided that he wanted to kill some of the Chetniks instead, they'd just go ahead and do that. But they did quite enthusiastically collaborate a number of times in many operations against the partisans. So the Ustaša state was rapidly losing its foothold over the country. Even within Bosnia, they were faced by Muslims who were trying to distance themselves from the crimes of the Ustašas because they were getting massacred in large number by Chetniks as retaliation especially for a lot of the early massacres against the Serbs, who were just then going in, Chetnik units in particular, were just going and massacring random Muslims just because
they're fucking Chetniks.
Yeah, because they're Chetniks, and they really, really don't like Muslims. So, I mean, even the Germans were, by 1943, seeing that the Croats were having a very hard time. In fact, that they are not in control of their territory at all. In fact, one of the SS, Waffen SS brigade leaders, this guy, Ernest Pick, said that Pavelić is only the mayor of Zagreb and excluding the suburbs.
Yeah.
And in 43, a German report to the German High Command said, in Croatia, there are 4 areas of power. A, the area occupied by German troops. B, the area occupied by Croatian authorities, essentially only the city of Zagreb. C, the autonomous Serbian areas that have made themselves independent, which have, quote-unquote, hedgehogged their position, and depending on conditions, do or do not cooperate with the Germans. And D, the Tito area, a Soviet state with good civilian administration and orderly military organization, about 100,000 men. So, I mean, this is these are the Germans. Clear. These are Germans basically saying we're fucked. The only areas that are under control are the shit that we hold, and then what the partisans have, and they're having a very hard time getting the anti-communist forces to be an effective fighting force, right? Because then Italy capitulates in 43. The Germans take over the areas that were previously administered by the Italians, which kind of spreads them out even further than they wanted to be, right? They have a lot more to manage and a lot more of unstable territory to try to administer. At this point, also Dalmatia rejoins the independent state of Croatia, but it was far too late for that to be effective, right? Dalmatia had been really brutally, the Italian occupation there was quite brutal, and many Dalmatians went to the partisans specifically. I mean, they had and suffered greatly, and took part in all of the major battles. Lots of Dalmatians were fighting and dying for the partisans at the time. So the Germans weren't having an easy time there either. And as 43 rolls around, 44, the situation becomes even more bleak for the independent state of Croatia. It's complete chaos now. They lack even any elementary economic function. The warfare since most of this partisan warfare was happening in the countryside, and the Ustašas were massacring peasants. Food production ceased in large parts of the country. Starvation was rampant. Basically, the situation was so dire that it was very clear that the state was not going to survive. And everybody seemed to know that except for Pavelić. And Pavelić, in some communications with Hitler, kept on reemphasizing the fact that, no, we've got this. All we have to do is regroup a little bit, and, we'll fight and win. But it was obviously clear that wasn't going to happen. And even as Rey has mentioned in the Ljotić episode, this Ljotić was trying to gather all these guys to go to Slovenia and have this white Yugoslav army to fight the partisans. The Ustašas were massacring some of them. They were massacring.
Yeah, because it required them to go from Serbia to Slovenia through the territory controlled by Ustašas.
Yes.
And even like in a situation when they're losing war, they're just finding time to kill like Serbian collaborationists who are trying to fight against the communists.
Yeah, they have the same enemy, and they're not good at even collaborating with them against them. And so as the situation deteriorates, they lose control. They completely lose control of everything that they held in modern day Serbia and Srem. That was lost even by 44, I believe. And then they continued. They lost control of Bosnia quite early on, and the situation there just became worse and worse. And to speed things up a little bit, they end up having their own great retreat, much like the Serbian collaborationists, although in even larger numbers, right? So as they begin their retreat into Austria, they are retreating primarily. Their aim is to retreat into areas that are at least controlled by the Americans or the British, to surrender to them. They figured that they would have a better chance of survival than to surrender to the partisans of the Red Army, and turns out they were correct. So this great Ustasha retreat into Austria was a motley crew as well. So it was not just the Worcestershire Militia, but also members of the Ustasha regular army and their families, who were fearing reprisal attacks from the partisans, but also these Montenegrin weirdos that we talked about in the last premium episode, and a division of SS Cossacks who the Germans sent in to Bosnia in 43 to terrorize the local population and try to reestablish order.
That is
which
horrifying.
Did not go over very well.
An SS Cossack is something you'd see out of like an old ID games game.
Yeah, exactly.
Terrifying character.
I think the German rationale for that was these guys are militantly anti-communist, and at least they're not hung up on this kind of fighting, picking sides between Chetniks and Ustašas. They'll just do the deed against the partisans. Turns out they just also like massacring people because they're fucking psychos. Right. And spent a lot of their time in Bosnia doing that. So, these guys are retreating with the Ustašas as well. And this takes us to the end of the Ustaša movement, their bloody rule at the end of 1945. So what we're talking about here is known now as the Bleiburg massacres, the Bleiburg retributions. It's become a major facet of modern day Croatian national thought, because these massacres that were carried out by the partisans against in retribution to these Ustašas and to their families and everybody who was there with them occurred actually after the German surrender. And this is important to note because the war in Yugoslavia actually lasted several weeks longer than the rest of the war in Europe. So the war in Europe was already over, and there was still fighting within Yugoslavia, although most of it had at this point been concentrated up into Slovenia and into Austria. And well, when the partisans got their hands on the retreating Ustašas, predictably, the outcome for these guys was not good. Yeah. And somewhat understandably as well. I mean, right? Yeah. These guys had spent between the years of 1941 to 45 just excelling at murdering people and doing more or less nothing else. And, you know...
I mean, of course, there were not all of the people there were Ustašas, like war criminals. Yes. You had like people who were mobilized by them to the like more kind of regular army of the Independent State of Croatia.
Yeah, recruits.
And like their families and so on. So, yeah, but I mean, it was a massacre that also included some people who were not, Ustaša war criminals for sure.
Yeah. And actually, in fact, most of the highest-ranking Ustaša war criminals were not killed in this, right? They all made it out, which we'll get to in a sec. I mean, Bleiburg, like I said, it's worth mentioning now because it's become this major rallying point for modern-day Croatian nationalists, which is to show that, of course, the communists were just as bad as the Ustašas, blah, blah, blah. And, they radical Croatian nationalists go and commemorate this event every year.
Well, not only
in
them,
Austria.
even often there were like representatives of the Croatian state there, no?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Basically it's like a neo-Nazi gathering in Austria.
Yeah.
But sometimes especially if the right-wing party was in power in Croatia, state officials would go there.
Yeah, and they would lay flowers down on the at these sites. Well, the rest of it is just complete like Ustasha neo-Nazi like shitfest. I mean, guys in Black Legion uniforms with Hitler mustaches, guzzling liquor and singing songs praising the camp commandant of Jasenovac.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't mention, but also like the Ustaša songs are the most bizarre thing. I mean, also.
I think we're gonna do a whole episode on music because it really features heavily in this, and they're really psychotic songs. I mean, the songs praising Luburic. It's like Jasenovac. That's the home of Max's Butchers, like is celebrating it in this kind of jovial way. Like Max's Butchers are there. Hey,
that's the guy that would dress up like a doctor and shit and like.
No, that's another. I think that's another guy. Yeah. There was like a Croatian Mengele as well. But yeah, of course, this is a rallying point for Croatian nationalists and for the Croatian state. Of course, the Austrian government in recent years has had to crack down on it because, of course, displaying neo-Nazi symbols in Austria is, illegal. Except these guys aren't flying swastikas; they have their, Croatian fascist imagery. So, at some point, the Austrian state has, in recent years, has started to intervene on that because it looks bad. It looks bad to have tens of thousands of Croats showing up inside your country, praising Nazi war criminals.
Welcomed by way too many locals.
Yeah. But then speaking of Nazi war criminals, as we just mentioned, a majority of the Ustasha leadership managed to escape, right, including Pavelić himself. And they were able to do so largely because of the famous rat lines, right, that took most of the major Nazi war criminals from Germany to South America. Now, I think what some people, many people know about the rat lines. They know about, Eichmann and everybody else ending up in Argentina, and they know the Catholic connection. But it's important to mention here that the rat lines, even for the Nazi war criminals, were organized primarily by Croatian Catholic clergy. They facilitated almost all of the rat lines, particularly this Croatian priest named Krunoslav Draganović, who more or less was one of the crucial figures in organizing the transport of Nazi war criminals to countries in Latin America, and including hiding them, of course, in like Franciscan monasteries in Italy before, and as we know with a lot of the major Nazi war criminals, a majority of Ustasha war criminals ended up in Argentina primarily. Some ended up in other places. I think Pavelić himself was also briefly in Chile, but was mostly in Argentina, somewhere in Uruguay, Paraguay as well. And Bolivia, of course. How can I forget Bolivia? Because in the recent right-wing government in Bolivia had several descendants of Ustasha emigres, which is pretty fucking wild when you think about it.
That's strange.
And so Pavelić and most of these high-ranking Ustašas end up in living, relatively normal lives in Argentina. Perón, the Perón government even gave some of them government jobs, and they were able to live pretty freely there. There's a book that covers this called the Real Odessa, which is about the Nazi rat lines. There's several chapters on just the Ustašas, which is I recommend as a reading. It's a good book. But Pavelić himself would survive for quite a bit longer, and but was assassinated in Spain.
He was shot in Argentina.
Yeah, he was shot in Argentina, and we had this exact same conversation the first time we fucking recorded this. God damn it. Jesus Christ.
It's the curse.
Yeah, sorry to the listener. Like I said, like we mentioned before, this is our second time recording this, and so it's kind of kind of wild.
Yeah, he took a long time to die, so...
Yeah, he did take quite some time to die.
Assassinated on one continent, died on the other. Yeah.
And he was assassinated by a Chetnik, right?
Yeah, I think a Serbian nationalist, yeah.
Yeah, a Serbian nationalist who shot him, and then he was mortally wounded and eventually would die in Spain, where his family continued to live. His daughter was there until relatively recently. Was alive until relatively recently.
Still defends dad.
Defends dad. Dad did nothing wrong. It was all a conspiracy by those damned Serbs and Jews.
Who else?
Didn't make her look very good. But the most notable thing that Pavelić did before he was assassinated and while he was in Argentina was reach out to Milan Stojadinović, which Ray talked about in another episode, and the establishment of the Croatian liberation movement in Buenos Aires, which was a continuation. You know, they saw themselves as the Ustasha government in exile, and this was the armed wing of their political organization, which sought to overthrow the communist state in Yugoslavia and to reestablish some sort of fascist independent state of Croatia. And going back to their roots, this was a movement that quite readily endorsed terrorism and would commit numerous terrorist attacks against Yugoslav state targets and civilians over the course of the Cold War.
What we wanted to talk about.
I was just about to say that, yeah.
Yes,
the whole point of this arc is to get to those guys. All of this.
Yeah, exactly. The whole point of this arc.
We're not even going to do it this arc.
Yeah, no, we're going to do
it later.
We want to talk about Croatian and Serbian terrorists from the 60s, 70s, 80s, but then we said, okay, we need to talk about the Second World War if we want to talk about that. But
if we have to talk about that, we're going to have to talk about the 19th century, of course.
Yes, so we started from the 19th century.
Yeah. And all those guys started from the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And of course, there are like Western intelligence connections to some of these nationalist terrorist groups, the Serbian and Croatian ones. Again, this is what we wanted to talk about. Yeah. We ended up talking about the
this is for
19th
you guys.
century and Second World War for a while. But that's so everything's clear, right? So we don't jump into the 60s and people are like, well, what about Pavelić?
Yeah.
Who is this guy? Yeah. Unfortunately, most of these other Ustašas in Argentina did not meet the fate of Pavelić and continued to live long lives in South America. And some of them would even live to see Croatia independent again in the 1990s.
How nice for them.
Indeed. I think it's a good way to end that, right?
Yeah. On a high note.
Yeah. I mean, it's super depressing, but...
Yeah. Hey, half the bad guys got away again. See you next time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more that, we didn't go into. There was some interesting ideological conflicts going on within the Ustasha leadership and within the movement itself.
Well, we're going to talk about some weird outliers there in the next episode.
We'll cover some of these other ones. And we also skipped over Muslims in general, but we're dedicating a separate episode to that. So, if the listeners...
they were important for Ustašas, and they're kind of their ideology. Croatian nation consists out of these two important segments. One is the Roman Catholic, the other the Muslim one. So
But it's definitely worth talking about that separately. So we have an episode for that as well.
All right, stay tuned.
Yeah, this has been a miserable experience.
I mean, as it should be.
As it should be. There's nothing good to be said other than that they lost the war. A lot of them died. But no.
Ciao.
Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.